I am Dr. Ranjana Tripathi, Associate Professor, Department of English, Rajarshi Tandon Girls Degree College, Allahabad. I am going to present a module of your PG course of Gender Justice entitled Feminist Writings in India in the Pre-Independence Era. The module attempts a brief account of the feminist writings in pre-independence India in the 19th century, and awareness towards women's issues was on the rise. The society was male dominated and the women had no role to play in public life. Their agony was not shared by traditional men around them. Their condition was at the lowest ebb. Sati, child marriage, illiteracy added to the gravity of the situation. It was at this time that the age of reformation set in. There was condemnation of atrocities against women. The elite men supported the women and worked to educate them. Consequently, there was a spurt of feminist writings in the second half of the 19th century. The module begins with briefly discussing the causes of this age of reformation and then proceeds towards the writings in pre-independent era. A major cause of the rising stride towards creativity, along with revolutionary changes in ideology of women writers, are interwoven with the historical and socio-political backdrop of the country. Conditions of women in India in the beginning of the 19th century were too bad. The sufferings they had to bear and endure them as a way of life. The hammer of time only molded them in the set norms of the society without any anguish of pain and torment. While the Western world in the 19th century was a witness to revolutionary contributions of feminist activities like Mary Wollstonecraft and Anna Wheels, who fought for women's rights in all aspects of life, the countries that were economically affluent and industrially advanced abound in social uprisings to promote equality in marriage and parenting and attaining property rights. Though in Europe and especially in England, the feminism had been around before the 19th century, but it gained momentum in the early 19th century. The feminists recognized the low stature of women and their struggle progressed steadily. Reformation set in around this time. The advent of colonial rule in India brought along with it prospects of change in the life of women. The colonial rulers were shocked to see the pathetic condition of women. Their desire to change the society was not only humanitarian, but they also tried to prove that the country needed an administration that could uplift the society because Indians were utterly incapable of living in a modern society. James Mill, in his History of India 1817, wrote that the condition of women in society is an index of society's place in civilization. For the colonial power, the condition of women in India legitimized their claim to civilizing the society. The atrocities of patriarchal practices authorized them to come forward as saviors of Indian women. They proclaimed to the world their responsibilities towards protecting women against the violent men. The leaders of India soon realized the vested interests of the colonial power. It is therefore not surprising that the Indian men came forward as leaders of Indian feminism. The early efforts of reforming women, bringing them to the forefront, providing education and elevating their status in society was done by the efforts of the men of the family and the leaders who established societies to reform the condition of women. In the latter half of the 19th century, the mothers, wives, daughters, sisters, influenced by ongoing campaigns, joined the movement themselves to took over the reins of leadership. In the initial stage, the women could not be approached except by the permission of men. Women's education became an issue both for the colonial power to prove their need and for the elite men to exhibit their competence and modernity. The women were the beneficiaries in both ways. Between 1820 and 1850, a series of campaigns resulted in the abolition of sati and widow remarriage. Women therefore were supported and empowered both by law and through education. Brahma Samaj in the eastern India, the Arya Samaj in northern India, and Theosophical Society in southern India, all movements led by men challenged the rituals of Indian society. The decade 1910 to 20 was one in which women's organizations were constituted. In the late 19th and early 20th century, local and regional women's organizations such as Bang Mahila Samaj and Aghore Kamini Nari Samiti in Bengal, the Satara Ablanati Sabha in Maharashtra and Mahila Seva Samaj in Bangalore, the Bharat Mahila Parishad in Banaras and Prayag Mahila Samiti in Allahabad. Some were practical social reform organizations and others were more platforms for discussion participated by women. One of the first attempts of coming together of women on the national level was made in 1908 when there was a Mahila Parishad or Ladies Congress at Madras attended by women in South India, in which 19 papers were presented by women in Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Marathi and English. Annie Besant in 1917 founded Women's Indian Association. This brought a change in the nature of women's organizations, which turned also towards nationalism due to Annie Besant's Home Rule League. Feminist writings took a definite turn in the Calcutta Congress 1917. For the first time, emphasis was laid on the role of women in the nationalist movement. Besides this, consciousness of women's rights was on the rise. The colonial rule spread English education, which opened the world before the Indian men and women, exposing to them the democratic ideals of equality. The first phase of feminist writings was dominated by personal memoirs and autobiographies. When awareness is spread and the women started thinking about the dominance of men and the reasons of their own backwardness in spite of opportunities available, they wrote about ways of reforming. With the independence movement gaining momentum, these women joined the movement and nationalism was also subject matter of their writings. The autobiographies were confessions, the stories of their own struggle they confronted to recognize themselves as individuals. They often lauded the respect they got from the men in the family, their husbands, fathers, brothers and sons. Their world was limited to the household. The love and respect they earned from their liberal elite husbands, their efforts in educating their children, raising them and establishing them in the new age, and the challenges they face in the process against the traditional family together with the anxieties and the support and love of the family elders and of adopting the manners of the new world. All these works were written as a consequence of the awareness of self, celebrating selfhood and raising the first voice of feminism, proclaiming to the world to recognize them as individuals. These writings, therefore, are the first rung in the ladder of feminist writings. Feminist writings in the early 19th century were largely an account of personal lives. Autobiographies were published more than ever before. in Bengali and Marathi. The early autobiographies are almost documents of social history of the fast changing era. The autobiographies were confessions, the stories of their struggles. They often loved the way they were handled by their family members after they got education. Rasundari Devi, born in 1810, wrote the first autobiography, Amar Jiban, My Life, that was published in 1876 and was in Bengali. Revealing her struggle and her efforts to read and write, she writes, "It is this my fate because I am a woman. Just because I am a woman, does it necessarily mean that trying to educate myself is a crime? Women were not supposed to read and write, so it was a difficult task. She was entirely self-taught. The book throws light on the condition of women in Bengal and the hardships they had to face to come out of their houses and face the society." Others who wrote autobiographies were Binodini Dasi, Kashibai Kanitkar, Ramabai Ranade, Lakshmibai Tilak. By the 1860s, education among women was spreading and their writings were reflected the effects of Reformation that had set in. Men had become conscious of their responsibilities towards women in their family. Savitribai Phule was wife of Jyotiba Phule, a Dalit social activist. She wrote in Marathi about the difficulties she had to face in her revolutionary ideology towards upliftment of women. Mokshdayini Mukhopadhyay was sister of W.C. Banerjee, the first president of Indian National Congress, and is known for her daring attack on men who thought that women had to be uplifted and improved. She proclaimed that it was they who need improvement and not the women. Tarabai Shinde is known for her article Istri Purush Tulna, published in Sattar, a journal published by Satya Shodhak Mandal. She is known to be a feminist thinker and critic, and as well versed in Sanskrit, Marathi, English, classical and modern literature. She exposes in her 40-page long essay the male stereotypes and images of women in response to the article in Pune Vaibhav. Tarabai Shinde, attacking the men, wrote that men are full of vices and they accuse women, but they themselves are responsible for the condition of women. Pandita Ramabai, 1858 to 1922, is often known to have laid the foundations of a movement in women's liberation in India. Her autobiography, My Testimony, published in 1907, and innumerable articles in newspapers all establish her as a legendary woman. She was one of the first women writers whose writings were enough to financially support her. Istri Dharmaniti, High Caste Hindu Women, Testimony are her major works. Ramabai was born in a family that had the courage to defy social justice. Her father, Anant Shastri, was a great scholar who had forced to travel interpreting and narrating Bhagavad and Purans. Amidst opposition from orthodox society, he taught Sanskrit to his wife, Lakshmi Bai, and 2 daughters. She wrote, "Even these priests and so-called scholars consider women as obstacles in pursuit of knowledge. They deny women the right to learn. How ungrateful! What injustice! Even as a child, she did not tolerate injustice. When she reached Calcutta with her brother after her parents passed away, the famine, she got immediate recognition as was the practice of a family, she delivered Hari Katha, and the news of a young woman's knowledge of Sanskrit scriptures attracted the attention of one and all, scholars, social workers, government officials, and even European officers witnessed her speeches and discourses. These were reported in prestigious newspapers like The Statesman. She was bestowed the title of Pandita and Saraswati by Professor Tone and Mahesh Chandra. Both of them were eminent people. After that, she was known as Pandita Ramabai Saraswati. In 1882, she put her views on women education before the Hunter Commission and emphasized the need for medical education for women. Hunter was so impressed by her views that he delivered a speech on Ramabai and her work in England. Queen Victoria took initiative of establishing medical dispensaries for women. Ramabai learnt English and visited London and soon adopted Christianity as an answer to the spiritual conflict she was undergoing. She had differences with Christian priests and had the courage to express her views. She wrote, "I have just with great effort freed myself of the yoke of Indian priestly tribe. I am not at all going to place myself under another similar one." One of her great achievements was establishing the Sharda Sadan, a house of Hindu widows and destitute women. She fought for the cause of Hindu women. In one of her letters to the editor of the Bombay Guardian, she wrote, "The shameful way in which women were made to submit to treatment by male doctors goes to prove that English authorities in general do not believe that Indian women are modest and need special consideration. Is not the Indian woman quite as modest as the English woman?" The fire of her words had great impact. She is remembered for her uninhibited writings. The High Caste Hindu Woman is a book that analyzes the problems and situations in the life of high caste Hindu women. She has criticized the lawmakers of Hindus and the prevalent customs. She even says the happy wife has nothing to complain of except the absence of freedom of thought and action. But since wives have never known from the beginning what freedom is, they are generally well content to remain in bondage. There is, however, no such thing as the family having pleasant times together. All the writings of Pandita Ramabai had influence on the women across the world. They were appreciated by men, women alike. Feminist writings shall always remain indebted to her contribution. Cornelia Sohrabji was another prominent woman who was a social activist also. She was a brilliant student having knowledge of Marathi, Gujarati, English, Persian, Urdu and Bengali. She went to study law at Oxford. Her first published work was Love and Life Behind Parda. There were 11 stories based mainly on the early experiences in legal life. There were stories of women and their tussle between tradition and modernity. Cornelia worked with widows, especially royal families whose estates were under the British government after the doctrine of lapse. In India Calling, written in 1934, she writes about her life between 1894 and 1923 and how she helped the widows whom she had referred as Pardanashins. In India Calling, she writes about instances that were the seclusion of women had prevented important evidence from being put before the court in property cases where rights of women were in question. Her other works were Behind the Twilight, followed by Sun Babies and Pardanashi, Subala, a child mother. She wrote on matters of law, politics and women that were published in British journals. Her last book, India Recalled, was published in 1936. Thus, Cornelia Sorabji's work unfolded to the world the reality of the court proceedings and how the widows of the royal families were at a loss due to the orthodox culture of their times. Begum Ruqayya was one of the greatest storytellers of the early times. The women in her family observed parda and were not allowed to read any book besides the Holy Quran. At the age of 16, she was married to Sayyid Sakhawat Hussain, who was a liberal Muslim and promoted her learning. He wished to open a school for girls, which he did after he passed away. The school was recognized as a first grade educational institution and is even today maintained its position. Together with these social activities, Begum Ruqayya also contributed to literature. She wrote several books in Bengali, Moti Chur, volume 1 and 2, Padmarag and Aborrodh Basini. Another fantasy, Sultana, was written in 1908. In her articles, she logically criticized the customs of society and the ordeal that the women suffered. She wrote, "The books of religions are nothing but code of conduct and directives prescribed by men." She wrote in the 19th century and argued against parda system. She points out the women are addicted to slavery and must come out of it. They should work hand in hand with men, only then will the society develop. In her articles, she is concerned about reforms in society through upliftment and care of women. She discusses the ways of care for infants and how to prevent mortality of children. Sultana's Dream, written in 1905, is an early novel and was published by the efforts of her husband in Indian Ladies magazine. Sultana's Dream about the place which is an ideal land and is controlled by women only. The men stay outdoors. She has attacked the men, and in the words of her husband, it is a terrible revenge. Sultana says, "In India, man is lord and master. He has taken to himself all power and privileges and shut up the women in the janana." Through the novel, Ruqayya accuses men of all the crime in the land. Once they are confined within the house, there is no crime in the land. She replaces zanana for mardana, and this brings an end to all the sins and crimes in Indian society. In the lady land, ladies rule over the country and control all social matters. Sultana explains the scientific reasons behind the works done in the lady land. Padmaraga, published in 1924, indicates that for a woman, marriage and household is not the ultimate goal. The novel is a female utopia. Women from different castes, creeds, regions, races and religions who have been victims of male atrocities join hands in Tarini Bhavan, a haven of women, to become literate and get training in craft so that they may be self-dependent. Ruqayya believed that all women across the globe and all religions and races are oppressed, and what is common amongst women is their element of tragedy. This brings them together on the same platform. They provide solace to each other. The book also shows how the women who are stronger can help the weaker ones. Her personal life experiences in managing a girls' school also has contributed to the episodes in the novel. Tarini Bhavan is named after the founder Deena Tarini Sen, belonging to Brahmo community. Tarini works for the salvation of women for whom life is unbearable. Ruqayya's Padmarag is located in her own times, and it reveals all her desires for alleviating the sorrows of women. grounded in reality, and the entire ethos and spirit is of her times. With the onset of nationalism in feminist writings, we have a few Hindi poets, Subhadra Kumari Chauhan. During her short span of life, she contributed a great deal to Hindi literature. Her poem Jhansi Ki Rani is one poem that instills patriotism in everyone. She was a social worker and struggled for the cause of women. Her most famous book, Mukul, was published in 1930. The Bikhre Moti in 1932, followed by a collection of short stories, The Intoxicated Women in 1934, Seedha Saade Chitra was published after her sudden death in an incident. She was a follower of Mahatma Gandhi and was the first woman satyagrahi from UP. She went to jail several times. Her poems were patriotic and her articles focused on women empowerment. Through her stories, she tried to bring about change in the times of women and attitude towards them. Her subjects were early marriage, widows, socio-economic dependence of women at home and outside. The feminist writings before independence were influenced by the social and political movements started by Mahatma Gandhi. The freedom movement, Antyodaya, upliftment of Dalits and untouchables, and the upliftment of women in particular. It was for the first time that the feminist writings focused on what happened within the woman rather than what happened to her. The mind of women, her desires, the contradictions that she faced, and the space she was promised was not getting its due. Some novels also dealt with how feminist issues were connected to other socio-political movements of the times. Geeta Sane, a Marathi novelist, Darcy Annapurna, in the short span of her life, wrote on issues raised by social reform movements. Her articles deal with the rights and duties of Hindu women, the law of divorce, parda, women's education, nationalism. Her stories are humorous and revolve around race of women in the house, superstitions and male domination. Kuntala Kumari Sabat, the first feminist writer in Oriya, she desired to see Orissa free from superstitions. She had great sympathy for the nationalist movement. Her poems were infused with patriotism. Her novels and articles aimed at the reform of women. Kamla Chaudhary joined the nationalist movement and took an active part in the civil disobedience movement of the modern India. Feminist writing in pre-independence India marked the early phase of the expanse of feminist writings. It can be called the most difficult period of feminist writing because it was in this phase that women learned to read and write, and that too amongst opposition and even opposition from the family. They had often not been taught by anyone else. They were self-taught, and with all the struggle they faced, they dared to write and managed publication. The documents are almost social history of the growth of women in the patriarchal society. They began with memoirs and autobiographies, moving to the celebration of selfhood and individualism. Later on, they wrote articles to reform the society and status of women. After 1930, they also were in the freedom movement, so their works pictured the impact of socio-political movement in women's liberation. It was not possible to discuss all the feminist writings of pre-independent era. Only those writers who have historically contributed to the change and pattern of feminist writings have been discussed here. Thank you.